The moon hung like a silver dollar in the Montana sky as Madeline Porter stumbled through the darkness, her face stinging with fresh welts, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood trickled from her split lip as she clutched her tattered shawl around her shoulders, desperately trying to put distance between herself and the place she had once called home. It was 1876, and at 18 years old, Madeline had endured more than her fair share of suffering at the hands of her father, a man whose grief over her mother's death had twisted into something ugly and cruel. She'd tried running once before, but he'd caught her at the edge of town, dragged her home by her hair, and beaten her so badly she couldn't leave her bed for 3 days. This time would be different. This time she had to get away. The night was cold for early autumn, and Madeline shivered as she made her way toward the small creek that cut through whispering pines. Her plan, what little of it existed, was to follow the water until she reached the next town over. She had $7.32 to her name, stolen from her father's dresser drawer while he lay in a drunken stupor. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. A twig snapped behind her, and Madeline's heart nearly stopped. Had he found her already? She whirled around, ready to run, only to come face to face with a horse, a magnificent buckskin with intelligent eyes that regarded her with curious interest. "Whoa there, Daisy," came a deep voice from the shadows. "What have we found?" The rider emerged into the moonlight, and Madeline got her first look at him. Tall and broad-shouldered, he sat easy in the saddle, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. Even in the darkness, she could make out his strong jawline and the glint of his watchful eyes. "You all right, miss?" he asked, his voice gentler now. "You're bleeding." Madeline took a step back, her hand instinctively going to her bruised face. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice cracking. "Just passing through. In the middle of the night, without so much as a horse or proper coat." He swung down from his saddle with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. "Now, I don't mean to pry, but a woman in your condition wandering alone after dark generally means trouble." "The only trouble I have is behind me," she said defiantly, even as tears threatened to spill. "And I aim to keep it that way." The stranger took a step closer, and in the moonlight she could see him better now. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 25, with kind eyes that didn't match his weathered face. "Name's Blake Keller," he said, removing his hat. "I've got a camp just up ahead. Coffee's still hot if you'd like some." Madeline hesitated. Her father had always warned her about strange men, though she'd come to realize his warnings were less about her safety and more about keeping her isolated. Still, this man was a stranger, and she had no reason to trust him. "I don't need charity," she said, lifting her chin despite the pain it caused. Blake replaced his hat and nodded thoughtfully. "Never said it was charity, just offering a cup of coffee to a fellow traveler. The night's cold, and it looks like you could use a moment's rest." Before she could respond, the distant sound of shouting reached them, accompanied by the jangling of hoarse tack and angry voices calling her name. "That wouldn't happen to be the trouble you mentioned?" Blake asked quietly. Madeline's blood ran cold. "My father," she whispered. "Please, I can't go back. He'll kill me this time." Blake's expression hardened as he glanced toward the source of the commotion. "Those marks on your face, he do that to you," she nodded, unable to speak through the fear closing her throat. "He'll regret that," Blake said, his voice dropping to a dangerous timbre. Then, more gently, he extended his hand. "Come on, miss. Daisy here is the fastest horse in the territory, and we'd best be gone before they catch up." With the voices growing louder, Madeline made her decision. She took Blake's outstretched hand and allowed him to help her onto his horse. In one fluid motion, he swung up behind her and turned Daisy away from the creek, nudging the mare into a canter that quickly carried them into the shelter of the pine forest. As they rode, Madeline found herself leaning back against the solid warmth of Blake's chest, the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them oddly comforting. She didn't know where they were going, but for the first time in years, she felt something like hope flutter in her chest. Blake kept Daisy at a steady pace through the night, taking paths that seemed invisible to Madeline, but that he navigated with confidence. They spoke little, the urgency of their flight demanding silence, but occasionally he would murmur directions to his horse or ask if Madeline was holding up all right. It was nearly dawn when they finally stopped at a small, hidden clearing beside a narrow stream. Blake slid from the saddle first, then reached up to help Madeline down. Her legs trembled beneath her, unused to riding and stiff from hours in the saddle. "We should be safe here for now," Blake said, tying Daisy to a young aspen. "It's one of my regular camps when I'm moving cattle." "Your father won't find it." Madeline looked around at the small clearing, noting the blackened circle of stones that indicated a well-used fire pit. "You're a cattleman, then?" Blake nodded, already gathering kindling for a fire. "Work for the Circle M Ranch just north of here." "Been their trail boss for about 3 years now." "And do you often rescue women in the middle of the night, Mr. Keller?" she asked, trying to sound braver than she felt. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Can't say that I do, miss." "Porter," she supplied after a moment's hesitation. "Madeline Porter." "Well, Miss Porter, I can't say it's a regular occurrence." The fire caught, and he fed it carefully, building it to a steady flame before setting a battered coffee pot among the coals. "But I've never been one to ignore someone in need." With the fire casting a warm glow across the clearing, Madeline could see Blake properly for the first time. His face was tanned from long days in the sun, with laugh lines around his eyes despite his serious expression. His hair was a rich brown, curling slightly where it touched his collar, and his eyes were a deep, striking blue that reminded her of the mountain lakes her mother had once painted. "You're staring, Miss Porter," he said mildly, though his eyes held amusement rather than reproach. Madeline flushed and looked away. "I'm sorry, I was just thinking." "About what to do next?" he asked, pulling a tin cup from his saddlebag and setting it near the fire. "Among other things." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly very aware of her disheveled appearance and the bruises that must be blooming across her face. "I hadn't really planned beyond getting away." Blake nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Well, I reckon the first order of business is to get you somewhere safe to rest up. I've got friends in Silver Creek, about half a day's ride from here. The widow Sullivan keeps rooms for rent and she doesn't ask too many questions." "I don't have much money," Madeline admitted. "And I don't know how to do much beyond keeping house. My father never allowed me to work." "One thing at a time," Blake said, pouring the now boiling coffee into the tin cup and offering it to her. "First, let's see to those cuts." From his saddlebag, he produced a small tin of salve and a clean bandana. With surprising gentleness for such large hands, he cleaned the worst of the cuts on her face, his touch careful and respectful. "Your father," Blake said as he worked, his voice neutral but his eyes burning with a controlled anger. "He do this often?" Madeline winced, both from the sting of the salve and from the question. "Since my mother died 5 years ago, he wasn't always like this." "No excuse," Blake said firmly. "No man has the right to raise his hand to a woman, least of all his own daughter." "He blames me," Madeline whispered, looking down at the cup in her hands. "Says I look too much like her. Says it's my fault she got sick, tending to me when I had the fever." Blake's hand paused in its ministrations, and his jaw tightened. "That's not how grief is supposed to work, Miss Porter. That's just cruelty wearing grief's clothes." Something about his words, the simple truth of them, broke something in Madeline. She'd spent so long believing her father's accusations that hearing someone dismiss them so easily was like a dam bursting. Tears spilled down her cheeks, stinging the cuts and mixing with the salve. Blake didn't try to stop her crying or offer empty platitudes. He simply finished tending her wounds, then moved to sit beside her, close enough to offer comfort but not so close as to make her uncomfortable. "You're safe now," he said when her tears had subsided, "and we'll figure out what comes next when you're rested." Madeline nodded, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the night was fading, leaving her hollow and drained. "You should sleep," Blake said, noticing her fatigue. "I'll keep watch." "You must be tired too," she protested weakly. Blake smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious face. "I've gone days without sleep on cattle drives. A few hours won't hurt me none. Besides," he added, his smile fading, "your father strikes me as the persistent type." He was right, Madeline knew. Elias Porter wouldn't give up easily. His pride wouldn't allow it, and he'd see her running away as the ultimate defiance. He'd hunt her until he found her, and then— "Don't think about it now," Blake said softly, reading her expression. "Sleep. We'll move on before noon." With the fire warming her and Blake's solid presence nearby, Madeline felt her eyes growing heavy. Despite everything, despite the fear and uncertainty that clouded her future, she found herself drifting into the first peaceful sleep she'd had in years. She woke to the smell of cooking meat and the soft sounds of Blake moving around the camp. The sun was high in the sky, filtering through the pine branches overhead to cast dappled shadows on the forest floor. "Afternoon," Blake said when he noticed her stirring. "Thought you might be hungry." He was cooking rabbit over the fire, the meat sizzling on a small iron skillet he must have unpacked while she slept. Madeline sat up, surprised to find she'd been covered with his coat during her rest. "Thank you," she said, handing it back to him, "for everything." Blake nodded, accepting the coat without comment. "Hope you like rabbit. It's not much, but it'll keep us going till we reach Silver Creek." They ate in companionable silence, the simple food tasting better than anything Madeline could remember. Perhaps it was the fresh air, or perhaps it was the first meal she'd eaten in freedom. "We should get moving soon," Blake said as they finished. "It's best we reach town before dark." "Do you think he's still looking?" Madeline couldn't bring herself to say "my father." Blake's expression was grim. "Men like that don't give up easy, but we've got a good head start, and Daisy knows these trails better than any horse in Montana." He packed up their small camp with efficient movements that spoke of years of practice. Madeline tried to help, though she felt clumsy beside his competence. Soon they were mounted again, with Madeline in front and Blake behind her, his arms encircling her as he held the reins. "Silver Creek's about 15 miles southwest," he explained as they set off. "It's not much of a town, but it's far enough from Whispering Pines that your father won't think to look there first." The day was clear and bright, the sky an endless blue that seemed to stretch forever over the rugged landscape. They rode through forests of pine and aspen, across meadows dotted with late wildflowers, and beside crystal streams that tumbled over smooth stones. Under different circumstances, Madeline might have found it beautiful. "Have you lived in Montana long?" she asked after they'd been riding for a while, partly to distract herself from her fears and partly because she was genuinely curious about the quiet man who had come to her rescue. "Born and raised," Blake replied. "My pa had a small spread north of here, but it wasn't enough to support us all. I've been working cattle since I was 14. Us all, 5 brothers, 2 sisters. I'm the 3rd oldest. Most of them have moved on now, married, headed further west, or found other work." "That sounds nice," Madeline said softly. Having family, I mean. Blake was quiet for a moment before responding. Family's supposed to be the people who protect you, not the ones you need protection from. The simple truth of his words hit Madeline hard. She'd spent so long thinking there must be something wrong with her, something that made her unlovable to her own father. The possibility that the fault lay with him, not her, was still a new and fragile thought. They stopped briefly around midday to rest Daisy and drink from a clear stream. Blake seemed increasingly alert, scanning their surroundings with watchful eyes as they continued their journey. By late afternoon, they began to descend into a valley, and Madeline caught her first glimpse of Silver Creek. It was indeed a small town, little more than a main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising above them like a sentinel. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from a distance, Madeline could see people moving about their business. "Not much to look at," Blake acknowledged, "but the people are decent enough." "It looks peaceful," Madeline said, and she meant it. After the tension and fear of the previous night, the ordinary sight of a quiet town going about its daily business seemed like a glimpse of paradise. They approached from the north, Blake guiding Daisy down a winding path that led to the outskirts of town. As they drew closer, Madeline became increasingly conscious of her appearance, her torn dress, the bruises on her face, her hair tangled from the long ride. "Blake," she began hesitantly, "what will we tell people? About me, I mean." He considered this for a moment. "The truth is always easiest to remember," he said finally. "But we don't have to tell all of it. You're my friend from up north, come to stay with Mrs. Sullivan while you look for work. The rest is nobody's business but yours." The simplicity of his solution surprised her. All her life, Madeline had been taught that family business stayed private, that the outside world must never know what happened behind closed doors. The shame of it had been ingrained so deeply that the idea of simply acknowledging she'd been hurt, without explaining why, felt strangely liberating. They entered town as the sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. People nodded to Blake as they passed, and he returned their greetings with an easy familiarity that spoke of frequent visits. No one stared too openly at Madeline, though she felt eyes on her bruised face. Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house stood at the far end of the main street, a two-story clapboard building with neat curtains in the windows and a small vegetable garden to one side. Blake tied Daisy to the hitching post out front and helped Madeline down from the saddle, his hands strong and steady as they circled her waist. "Let me do the talking," he murmured as they approached the door. "Maggie Sullivan's a good woman, but she's protective of her establishment." Madeline nodded, suddenly nervous. What if this woman turned her away? What if her father had already sent word to nearby towns? The door opened before they reached it, revealing a sturdy woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes took in Blake first with approval, then swept to Madeline, narrowing slightly at the sight of her face. "Blake Keller," she said, her voice carrying a hint of an Irish accent. "Been wondering when you'd pass through again." "Mrs. Sullivan," Blake greeted her, removing his hat. "Hope you've been well." "Well enough," she replied, her gaze still on Madeline. "And who might this be?" "This is Miss Madeline Porter," Blake said. "She's looking for work in Silver Creek and needs a place to stay for a while. I was hoping you might have a room available." Mrs. Sullivan's expression softened slightly as she addressed Madeline directly. "Those are nasty bruises, child. Looks like you've had a rough time of it." Madeline glanced at Blake, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Yes, madam," she admitted. "I have." Something passed between the two women in that moment, an unspoken understanding that transcended words. Mrs. Sullivan stepped back from the doorway, gesturing them inside. "I've a small room at the back," she said briskly. "It's not much, but it's clean and quiet. $2 a week, including breakfast and supper." "Thank you, madam," Madeline said, relief washing over her. "That's very kind." "It's not kindness, it's business," Mrs. Sullivan corrected her, though her tone lacked bite. "Though I suspect you could use a bit of both right now." She led them through a tidy parlor and down a hallway to a small room that overlooked the back garden. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a simple wooden chair beside a small window. To Madeline, who had expected to be sleeping rough for the foreseeable future, it looked like luxury. "Supper's at 6, Mrs. Sullivan informed her. "Bathrooms at the end of the hall. Hot water for bathing costs extra, but I suspect you might appreciate it tonight." "Yes, madam, very much," Madeline agreed fervently. Mrs. Sullivan nodded and turned to Blake. "I assume you'll be staying at the hotel, if they've got a room," he confirmed. "I need to see to Daisy first, then I'll be back to check on Miss Porter." "I'll have Martha draw a bath, Mrs. Sullivan said, then added with unexpected gentleness, "and perhaps find a clean dress that might fit." When she had gone, Madeline turned to Blake, overwhelmed by his kindness. "I don't know how to thank you," she began, but he waved her words away. "No need for that," he said. "Get yourself cleaned up and rested. I'll come by after supper to make sure you're settled in." After he left, Madeline sank onto the edge of the bed, her emotions a tangled mess of relief, fear, gratitude, and uncertainty. She had escaped, at least for now, but what came next? She had little money, few skills that would earn her a living, and the constant threat of her father finding her. But for the first time in years, she also had something resembling hope and an unexpected ally in a blue-eyed cowboy who had promised that her father would regret what he had done to her. True to her word, Mrs. Sullivan sent a young maid to prepare a bath, and Madeline nearly wept at the simple luxury of hot water and soap that smelled of lavender. She scrubbed away the dirt and fear of the past 24 hours, careful of her bruises and cuts, and washed her long auburn hair until it gleamed. The dress that Martha had brought was plain but clean, a simple blue cotton that was perhaps a bit too large but could be belted at the waist. It felt strange to wear someone else's clothes, but Madeline was grateful to be out of her torn and dirty dress. Supper was served in a small dining room where several other boarders, 2 elderly sisters, and a young schoolteacher eyed Madeline with curious but not unkind glances. Mrs. Sullivan made no introductions beyond Madeline's name, allowing her the privacy of her circumstances, for which she was grateful. The meal was simple, but hearty roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread, and Madeline realized she was ravenous. She ate as politely as she could while still satisfying her hunger, aware of the occasional glances from the other women, but too hungry to be overly concerned by them. She had just returned to her room when there was a soft knock at her door. Blake stood in the hallway, hat in hand, looking freshly washed and wearing a clean shirt. "You're looking better," he said, his eyes taking in her clean dress and damp hair. "I feel better," Madeline admitted, "though I'm still not sure what I'm going to do next." "That's partly what I wanted to talk to you about," Blake said. "May I come in? Or we could speak in the parlor if you'd prefer." Madeline hesitated only briefly before stepping aside to let him enter. Mrs. Sullivan ran a respectable establishment, but she doubted the landlady would approve of a man in her room, even with the door open. Still, she trusted Blake in a way that surprised her, given how little she knew him. Blake seemed to sense her concern, for he remained standing near the door, maintaining a respectful distance. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble. "Your father's a dangerous man, and he's not likely to give up easily." Madeline nodded, the fear she'd managed to suppress throughout the day returning with a vengeance. He'll look for me. He's never let me have friends or go places alone. I'm all he has left in his mind. That's not love, Miss Porter, that's possession. Blake's voice was gentle but firm. And you're not his to possess. I know that, she said softly. At least, I'm starting to. Blake nodded, his expression serious. I need to return to the ranch tomorrow. We're moving cattle to the northern pastures before winter sets in. But I don't feel right leaving you here alone, not with him searching for you. I'll be all right, Madeline said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. I can find work in town, perhaps. Mrs. Sullivan mentioned the dressmaker might need help. That's good, Blake agreed. But it doesn't solve the problem of your father. Silver Creek isn't that far from Whispering Pines. Eventually, he'll think to look here. Madeline sank onto the edge of the bed, the weight of her situation suddenly overwhelming. What can I do? I can't keep running forever. No, Blake agreed, you can't. He hesitated, seeming to weigh his words carefully. There is another option, but I'm not sure you'll like it. Madeline looked up at him, curious despite her fear. What option? Blake took a deep breath. The cattle drive I'm leading, it's taking us north to the winter pastures. From there, I'll be heading to Butte City to meet with some potential buyers. If you were to come with us, it would put nearly 100 miles between you and your father. Go with you, Madeline repeated, startled. On a cattle drive. It's not as crazy as it sounds, Blake said quickly. We have a cook wagon where you could ride. It's hard work and rough country, but no one would think to look for you there. And once we reach Butte City, you'd have more options. It's a growing town with plenty of work for those willing to do it. Madeline stared at him, trying to process his suggestion. Why would you do this for me? You hardly know me. Blake's expression turned serious. Because what happened to you isn't right, and I can't in good conscience leave you here knowing your father might find you. He paused, then added more softly, and because I think you deserve a chance at a life of your own choosing. There was something in his eyes when he said this, a sincerity that couldn't be feigned. Madeline found herself wanting to trust him, wanting to believe that there could be a future beyond the fear and pain of her past. When would we leave? She asked, surprised by her own willingness to consider his plan. Day after tomorrow, Blake replied. It would give you time to rest and gather anything you might need for the journey. I don't have much, Madeline admitted. Just what I was wearing when you found me and what Mrs. Sullivan has lent me. Blake nodded thoughtfully. I'll see about getting you some proper traveling clothes and a warm coat. The nights get cold up north. I can't let you spend your money on me, Madeline protested. You've done too much already. Consider it an advance, Blake suggested. You can help our cook, old Pete, with the meals. He's been complaining about his joints something fierce this season. Madeline thought about his offer. A cattle drive would be hard work, certainly, but it would also be the last place her father would think to look for her. And Butte City was far enough away that she might truly be able to start over. All right, she said finally, I'll go with you. The relief that flashed across Blake's face suggested he had been genuinely concerned for her safety. Good, he said. That's good. I'll make the arrangements. He moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Your father, he said quietly. He doesn't get to decide who you are anymore. Remember that, Miss Porter. With those words, he left, closing the door softly behind him and leaving Madeline to contemplate the sudden, unexpected turn her life had taken in less than 24 hours. That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the quiet sounds of the boarding house settling around her, Madeline found herself thinking not of her father or the dangers that still lay ahead, but of Blake Keller's steady blue eyes and the quiet strength he seemed to carry with him like a shield against the world's harshness. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without fear shadowing her dreams. The next day passed in a flurry of preparation. Blake returned mid-morning with a bundle containing a sturdy pair of boots, thick woolen socks, a warm coat, and a pair of practical riding skirts with matching blouses. There was also a wide-brimmed hat to protect her from the sun and a pair of leather gloves. "The woman at the general store helped me with the sizes," he explained somewhat awkwardly when Madeline expressed her concern about the expense. "And don't worry about the cost. The ranch can afford it." Madeline had her doubts that the Circle M Ranch was actually covering these expenses, but she accepted the gifts with as much grace as she could muster. The truth was, she needed these things, and her pride would do her little good if she froze on the trail. Mrs. Sullivan, for her part, seemed to approve of the plan once Blake explained it to her. "Butte City's a good place for a fresh start," she agreed. "My sister's husband found work in the copper mines there last year, says they're always looking for good people." She provided Madeline with a small cloth bag to carry her belongings and insisted on including a few practical items: a hairbrush, a bar of soap, a small sewing kit, and a worn but serviceable blanket. "The nights get cold on the trail," she said, echoing Blake's warning. "And men never think about the small comforts." By evening, Madeline was both nervous and oddly excited about the journey ahead. The prospect of traveling with a group of cowboys and a herd of cattle was intimidating, but the alternative waiting in Silver Creek for her father to eventually find her was unthinkable. Blake came by after supper to finalize their plans. "We'll head out at first light," he told her. "I'll come by to get you around dawn. Pete's eager to meet you, says it'll be nice to have someone to talk to besides a bunch of trail-worn cowboys." Madeline smiled at that. "I hope I won't disappoint him. My cooking skills are limited to what my father would eat, which wasn't much beyond meat and potatoes." "Pete can teach you," Blake assured her. "He's been cooking on drives for 30 years, claims he can make a decent meal out of boot leather if he has to." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the town marshal, a tall man with a graying mustache who nodded cordially to Blake before turning his attention to Madeline. "Miss Porter," he asked, his expression professionally neutral. "Might I have a word?" Madeline felt her blood run cold. Had her father sent word already? Was the marshal here to force her to return to Whispering Pines? Blake must have sensed her fear, for he moved slightly closer to her, his posture protective without being threatening. "Evening, Marshal Davis. Is there a problem?" The marshal's gaze flicked between them. "No problem necessarily. Just looking into a report we received from over in Whispering Pines. A man named Porter claims his daughter's been kidnapped." Madeline's hands began to tremble, and she clasped them tightly in her lap to hide her reaction. Blake, however, didn't miss a beat. "As you can see, Marshal, Miss Porter is here of her own free will," he said calmly. "And the only crime committed was by the man who put those bruises on her face." Marshal Davis looked at Madeline more carefully, his eyes taking in the fading marks on her face. His expression softened slightly. "That true, miss. You leave of your own accord." Madeline took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Yes, sir, my father. He was not kind to me. I left to save myself from worse treatment." The marshal nodded slowly. "I see." He seemed to consider his next words carefully. "The law's particular about family matters. A father has rights over his unmarried daughter, especially if she's not of age." "I'm 18, sir," Madeline said quickly, "and I have been for several months. Can you prove that?" The marshal asked, not unkindly. Madeline hesitated. Her father had kept all the family documents locked away. I don't have papers with me," the marshal sighed. "Makes things complicated then. Your father's filed a formal complaint, says you stole money from him before you left. $7.32, Madeline admitted. It was all I could find. I needed to get away. Blake's jaw tightened. Marshall, surely you're not suggesting returning her to a man who beat her so badly she had to flee in the night. I'm not suggesting anything yet, the marshal replied evenly. Just gathering facts, but the law is the law, and I've got a complaint to investigate. A heavy silence fell over the room. Madeline felt as though the walls were closing in on her. After everything, after thinking she might finally be free, her father's reach was still long enough to drag her back. What if she wasn't unmarried? Blake asked suddenly. Both Madeline and the marshal looked at him in surprise. What are you suggesting, Keller? The marshal asked, his eyes narrowing. Blake met Madeline's startled gaze briefly before turning back to the marshal. I'm suggesting that if Miss Porter were married, her father would have no legal claim on her whatsoever. Madeline's heart began to race as she realized what Blake was proposing. The marshal seemed equally stunned. You offering to marry the girl, you barely know her. I know enough, Blake said firmly. I know she deserves better than what she's had, and I know I can provide that. The marshal looked between them, his expression unreadable. This is mighty sudden, Keller. Marriage isn't something to enter into lightly, especially not to solve a legal problem. It would solve it, though, wouldn't it? Blake pressed. Her father would have no claim on a married woman. That's true enough, the marshal conceded reluctantly. Blake turned to Madeline, his eyes serious. Miss Porter, I know this isn't how things are normally done, but I can offer you protection, respect, and my solemn promise to be a good husband. It would be a real marriage, not just a legal convenience. Madeline stared at him, too shocked to speak. This man, who had already risked so much to help her, was now offering to bind his life to hers permanently. It was overwhelming, impossible, and yet. You don't have to answer right away, Blake said gently. It's a big decision. No, Madeline said, finding her voice at last. No, I don't need time. If you're truly willing, then yes. I'll marry you, Mr. Keller. The marshal looked between them, skepticism written clearly on his face. You sure about this, miss? Marriage is meant to be forever. Madeline met his gaze steadily. I'm sure that I cannot go back to my father, and I'm sure that Mr. Keller has shown me nothing but kindness and respect since the moment we met. That's more than I can say for the man who raised me. The marshal sighed, then nodded. All right, then. If you're both determined, I can perform the ceremony tomorrow morning before you leave town. But I warn you both, this is binding in the eyes of the law and the Lord. We understand, Blake said solemnly, and we thank you, Marshal. After the marshal left, promising to return at dawn, an awkward silence fell between Blake and Madeline. It was Blake who finally broke it. I know this isn't what you planned, he said quietly. And if you change your mind by morning, I'll understand. We can find another way. Madeline studied him, this man who had become her protector and now offered to be her husband. He was handsome, yes, but it was his kindness, his steady strength, that drew her to him. In the space of 2 days, she had come to trust him more than she had trusted anyone in years. I won't change my mind, she said softly, but I have to ask, why would you do this? Tie yourself to a stranger, take on her troubles. Blake was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as if seeing something beyond the small room. My youngest sister, he said finally, ran away at 16. Her husband found her eventually, brought her home, and beat her so badly she lost the baby she was carrying. No one helped her, not the law, not the church, not even our parents, who said she'd made her bed and had to lie in it. He looked at Madeline, his eyes dark with remembered pain. She hanged herself in the barn the next day. I was away, working a drive. By the time I got home, there was nothing left to do but bury her. Oh, Blake, Madeline whispered, reaching instinctively for his hand. "I'm so sorry." He accepted her touch, his large hand enfolding hers. "I promised myself then that if I ever had the chance to help someone in her position, I would. No matter the cost." Madeline understood then that his offer was born not just of kindness or attraction, but of a deep wound that had never fully healed. It humbled her, this glimpse into his pain, and made her all the more certain of her decision. "I'm honored to accept your proposal," she said softly. "And I promise to be a good wife to you, Blake Keller." He smiled then, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "And I promise to be a husband you never need to fear, Madeline Porter." The name struck her, reminding her that by this time tomorrow she would be Madeline Keller. No longer her father's possession, but a woman with a new name and a new chance at life. They talked a while longer, making plans for the morning and the journey ahead. When Blake finally left, promising to return at dawn, Madeline sat by the window of her small room, watching the stars emerge over Silver Creek. Marriage had never featured in her desperate plans for escape. Indeed, after watching her father's grief transform into cruelty following her mother's death, Madeline had doubted that true, healthy love existed at all. Yet here she was, agreeing to marry a man she barely knew because she trusted him with her life and her future. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was hope, and after years of fear and pain, hope felt very much like a miracle. Dawn broke clear and cool over Silver Creek as Madeline dressed in one of her new outfits, a practical navy blue riding skirt and white blouse, with the sturdy boots Blake had provided. She brushed her hair until it shone, then braided it simply, wishing for a mirror to check her appearance. A soft knock at her door announced Mrs. Sullivan, who entered carrying a small nosegay of late wildflowers. "Not much of a bridal bouquet," the older woman said gruffly, "but every bride should have flowers." Madeline accepted them with genuine gratitude. "They're beautiful. Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan." The landlady nodded, then surprised Madeline by reaching out to adjust her collar. "Marriage is hard work, child. Even when it starts under the best circumstances, which these certainly aren't. But that young man has a good heart. I've known him for years, and he's never been anything but honorable." "I believe that," Madeline said softly. "Good, Mrs. Sullivan stepped back, seemingly satisfied with Madeline's appearance. "Now the marshal's waiting in the parlor and your groom arrived a few minutes ago. Are you ready?" Madeline took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. "Yes, I'm ready." The parlor had been arranged for the simple ceremony, with the boarders gathered as witnesses. Blake stood by the fireplace, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt with his best jeans and boots. His eyes found Madeline as she entered, and the warmth in his gaze steadied her. Marshal Davis performed the ceremony with brisk efficiency, but his words were nonetheless solemn as he spoke of the sanctity of marriage and the responsibilities each would bear toward the other. When it came time for the vows, Blake's voice was clear and unwavering as he promised to protect, respect, and provide for Madeline for all the days of his life. When her turn came, Madeline was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice as she vowed to honor, support, and remain faithful to Blake. The simple gold band he placed on her finger had been his mother's, he explained quietly, given to him before she passed for his future bride. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the marshal declared. "You may kiss your bride, Keller." Blake hesitated, his eyes questioning as they met Madeline's. She gave a slight nod, and he leaned forward to place a gentle, chaste kiss on her lips there first. It was brief but unexpectedly sweet, and Madeline felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with embarrassment. There was a small celebration afterward, coffee and Mrs. Sullivan's fresh baked cinnamon buns before Blake announced it was time to leave if they wanted to reach the cattle camp by nightfall. The goodbyes were brief but heartfelt. Mrs. Sullivan pressed a small package of food for their journey into Madeline's hands, and the schoolteacher, Miss Abernathy, offered a book of poetry for the quiet evenings. Then they were outside, where Daisy waited patiently alongside a sturdy bay mare that Blake introduced as Penny. "She's yours," he said, helping Madeline mount. "Every ranch wife needs her own horse." "Blake, I can't accept you can," he interrupted gently. "You're my wife now. What's mine is yours." The simple statement, delivered without pretense or expectation, touched Madeline deeply. All her life, she had owned nothing that her father couldn't take away on a whim. Now this man, her husband of less than an hour, was offering her not just protection but a share in everything he had. They rode out of Silver Creek as the town was coming fully awake, heading north toward the foothills where the Circle MTK's cattle were being gathered for the drive. Blake rode beside her, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing stories about the area. As they traveled, Madeline found herself studying her new husband when he wasn't looking. In the clear morning light, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of long days in the sun, the tiny scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his mouth naturally curved into a slight smile even when he wasn't speaking. He was handsome in a rugged, unpolished way that suited the wild country around them. More than that, though, she was drawn to the quiet confidence with which he carried himself. There was nothing of her father's bullying dominance in Blake, no need to control or intimidate to prove his strength. Instead, he seemed comfortable in his own skin, secure enough in himself to be gentle with others. By midday, they stopped beside a small stream to rest the horses and eat some of Mrs. Sullivan's provisions. Blake spread his coat on the ground for Madeline to sit on, a gesture that seemed to embarrass him slightly when she thanked him. "Not used to having a lady along," he explained, settling beside her. "The boys and I don't stand much on ceremony on the trail." "I'm not much of a lady," Madeline admitted, accepting the bread and cheese he offered. "My father made sure I knew how to cook and clean, but he didn't hold with fancy manners, as he called them." Blake's expression darkened briefly at the mention of her father, but he kept his tone light. "Well, you seem pretty ladylike to me. Besides, manners are just about treating people with respect. You've got that part down fine." They ate in companionable silence for a while, listening to the stream's gentle gurgle and the occasional calls of birds in the nearby trees. It was peaceful in a way Madeline hadn't experienced in years, and she found herself reluctant to leave when Blake suggested they continue their journey. "The cattle camp's still a few hours' ride," he explained, helping her back onto Penny. "And I should introduce you to the men before we turn in for the night." As they rode, Blake told her more about the Circle M Ranch and the upcoming cattle drive. The ranch was owned by a man named Marcus Miller, who had started with a small herd 20 years earlier and built it into one of the most successful operations in the territory. The drive would take them north to winter pastures near the Canadian border, a journey of about 2 weeks if the weather held. "What will the other men think?" Madeline asked, suddenly anxious about meeting Blake's colleagues. "About you showing up with a wife they've never met." Blake considered this. "They'll be surprised, certainly, but they're good men mostly, respectful, and once they hear you'll be helping Pete with the cooking, they'll probably be downright delighted." "And Mr. Miller, will he mind having an extra person on the drive?" "Marcus is fair," Blake assured her. "He knows I wouldn't make a decision like this lightly. Besides, he's always saying Pete needs help, especially with his arthritis acting up." Despite his reassurances, Madeline felt her anxiety growing as they approached the cattle camp late that afternoon. The setting sun cast long shadows across the valley, where hundreds of cattle were gathered, their lowing creating a constant backdrop to the bustle of activity around several wagons and tents. Men moved purposefully about the camp, some on horseback keeping the cattle contained, others preparing for the evening meal or tending to equipment. They were a rough-looking lot, weather-beaten and trail-hardened, and Madeline felt distinctly out of place as Blake led her toward them. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Work paused as cowboy after cowboy looked up to see Blake riding in with a woman beside him. Whispers spread quickly through the camp, and by the time they reached the central fire, a small crowd had gathered to meet them. A tall, lean man with silver threading his dark hair stepped forward, his expression curious but not unwelcoming. "Keller," he greeted Blake, his eyes moving to Madeline. "Didn't expect you back with company." "Mr. Miller," Blake responded, dismounting and helping Madeline down from Penny. "This is Madeline Porter, that is Madeline Keller now. My wife." The announcement caused a stir among the gathered cowboys, with several exchanging glances of surprise and a few letting out low whistles. Miller's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Your wife," he repeated. "Since when?" "Since this morning," Blake replied evenly. "It was unexpected, but sometimes life takes surprising turns." Miller studied them both for a long moment, his shrewd eyes taking in Madeline's nervous posture and the fading bruises on her face. Something in his expression softened. "Well," he said finally, extending a hand to Madeline, "welcome to the Circle M, Mrs. Keller. Can't say we offer much in the way of comfort for a new bride, but any wife of Blake's is welcome here." Madeline accepted his handshake, relieved by his acceptance. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. I understand you might not have planned for an extra person on your drive. I'm willing to earn my keep. Blake mentioned your cook might appreciate some help." Miller's face broke into a genuine smile at that. "Pete? Lord, yes. He's been threatening to quit and move to California every drive for the past 5 years. Having a woman's touch in the chuck wagon might just keep him with us another season." He turned, scanning the camp, then called out, "Pete, get over here and meet the answer to your prayers." An elderly man with a stooped back and a face like weathered leather emerged from the largest wagon, wiping his hands on a stained apron. He approached slowly, eyeing Madeline with undisguised curiosity. "What's this about answers to prayers?" he asked, his voice gravelly from years of shouting over campfires and cattle. "Pete, meet Mrs. Keller," Miller said with a hint of amusement. "Blake's bride. She's offering to help you in the chuck wagon during the drive." Pete's bushy eyebrows shot up in surprise, and he looked from Madeline to Blake and back again. Then, to Madeline's astonishment, he broke into a gap-toothed grin. "Well, ain't that something?" he chuckled. "Blake Keller, the confirmed bachelor, shows up with a pretty wife out of nowhere." He extended a gnarled hand to Madeline. "Welcome, Mrs. Keller. If you can make decent biscuits and don't mind getting up before the sun, you and I will get along just fine." Madeline shook his hand, returning his smile. "I make tolerable biscuits, Mr. Pete, and I'm used to early mornings." "Just Pete," he corrected. "No Mr. needed out here." He turned to Blake with a wink. "You done good, boy. She's got nice manners and pretty eyes, probably too good for the likes of you." Blake laughed, the tension in his shoulders easing visibly. "No argument there, Pete." The other cowboys introduced themselves one by one, their initial surprise giving way to friendly curiosity. There was Tom, the youngest at barely 20, with freckles scattered across his sunburned face. Hank, a silent giant of a man with hands like sledgehammers. Charlie, whose quick wit and easy smile suggested a natural charmer. and several others whose names blurred together in Madeline's nervous state. They were polite to a man, tipping their hats and welcoming her to the drive, though she caught a few exchanging curious glances when they thought she wasn't looking. It was clear that Blake's sudden marriage was as much a surprise to them as it had been to Miller. As the introductions concluded, Pete shuffled back toward the chuck wagon, gesturing for Madeline to follow. "Might as well show you the setup while there's still light," he said. "Supper's almost ready, and these boys get mighty ornery when they're hungry." Blake gave her an encouraging nod. "Go ahead. I need to speak with Miller about tomorrow's route." The chuck wagon was a marvel of organization, with every pot, pan, and provision stored in its proper place. Pete moved around it with the familiarity of long practice, explaining where everything was kept and how the daily routine would work once they were on the trail. "We're up by 4, he told her, stirring a pot of beans that smelled heavenly after a day on horseback. "Breakfast ready by 5, on the trail by 6. Lunch is cold most days, biscuits, jerky, maybe some cheese if it hasn't gone bad. Then supper when we make camp, usually around dusk." Madeline listened attentively, determined to learn quickly. This life was so different from anything she had known, yet there was something appealing about its straightforward simplicity. Everyone had a job to do, a purpose, a place in the order of things. "Where will I sleep?" she asked when Pete paused in his instructions. The old cook's face creased in a smile. "Well, married folk generally prefer their privacy, so I reckon Blake will set up your tent a bit away from the others. The boys will keep a respectful distance, they're a rowdy bunch, but they know better than to bother a man's wife." Madeline felt her cheeks warm at the reminder of her new marital status. She and Blake had not discussed the practical aspects of their arrangement, and the realization that they would be expected to share a tent sent a flutter of nervous anticipation through her. Pete noticed her blush and chuckled kindly. "Don't you worry, Mrs. Keller. Blake's a good man. He'll treat you right." Before Madeline could respond, there was a commotion from the edge of camp, shouts and the sound of horses approaching at speed. She looked up to see Blake and Miller striding toward the disturbance, their expressions grim. "Stay here," Pete advised, his jovial manner suddenly serious. "Something's not right." From her position by the chuck wagon, Madeline could see 3 riders entering the camp, their horses lathered from hard riding. The lead rider was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a familiar set to his shoulders that made her blood run cold. "No," she whispered, instinctively stepping back into the shadows of the wagon. "It can't be." But it was. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking Elias Porter's imposing figure as he dismounted and confronted Miller and Blake. Though she couldn't hear their words, the aggressive stance of her father and the defensive posture of her new husband told her all she needed to know. "That's your pa, isn't it?" Pete asked quietly, having followed her gaze. Madeline nodded, her throat too tight for words. Pete's weathered face hardened. "Figured as much, seeing those marks on your face when you arrived. You stay put, Mrs. Keller. Blake and Mr. Miller won't let him near you." But even as Pete spoke, her father's voice rose loud enough to carry across the camp. "Where is she? I know she's here." "That man stole my daughter and I want her back now." Blake's response was too low to hear, but his stance was protective, his hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. Miller stood beside him, his authority evident in his calm but firm posture. The confrontation continued for several tense minutes, with her father's voice occasionally rising in angry outbursts while Blake and Miller remained steadfastly between him and the camp. The other cowboys had quietly positioned themselves around the perimeter, some with rifles casually but visibly present. Finally, Miller gestured to one of the men who trotted over to the chuck wagon. "Mrs. Keller," he said respectfully, Mr. Miller asks if you'd come over. Says it might resolve things faster. Blake agreed, or I wouldn't be asking. Madeline's fear threatened to overwhelm her, but she straightened her shoulders and nodded. I'll come. Pete grabbed her arm before she could leave. You don't have to, girl. We can run him off without you having to face him. No, Madeline said, finding strength in the simple fact that she now had people willing to stand between her and her father. No, I need to do this. With the cowboy beside her, Madeline walked across the camp, feeling every eye upon her. As she approached the group, she could see her father more clearly, his face flushed with anger, his massive hands clenched into fists at his sides. The sight of him sent a chill through her, but she kept walking. Blake moved immediately to her side when she reached them, his hand gently taking hers in a gesture that was both protective and a clear statement to her father. Madeline drew strength from his touch, standing straighter as she faced the man who had terrorized her for years. "Hello, Father," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. Elias Porter's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "Madeline," he growled, "what in God's name do you think you're doing? Get over here right now. We're going home." "No, Father," Madeline replied, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. "I'm not going anywhere with you, not ever again." "You ungrateful little—" He took a step toward her, but Blake moved smoothly between them, his posture relaxed but his eyes cold. "That's close enough, Porter," Blake said quietly. "You're speaking to my wife, and I'd appreciate a civil tone." Her father's eyes bulged. "Wife? What nonsense is this? She's my daughter." "She's 18 years old," Blake countered, "and we were legally married this morning in Silver Creek. Marshall Davis performed the ceremony himself." "I don't believe you," Porter spat. "She's lying to you, mister. She's always been a deceitful girl, just like her mother." Madeline felt Blake tense beside her, but his voice remained level. "I have the marriage certificate right here, if you'd care to see it." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, holding it out. Miller took it and examined it before passing it to Porter, who snatched it angrily. "This changes nothing," Porter insisted after glancing at the document. "She stole money from me before she ran off. That's a crime." "How much?" Miller asked, speaking for the first time. Porter looked momentarily taken aback by the direct question. $7.32, he finally admitted. Miller reached into his pocket and pulled out a wallet. Counting out $8, he held it out to Porter. "Consider it repaid with interest." Porter ignored the money, his gaze fixed hatefully on Madeline. "You think you can just run away from your responsibilities after everything I've done for you, what you've done for me?" Madeline repeated, a lifetime of suppressed anger suddenly rising in her. "You mean beating me, keeping me prisoner, blaming me for Mother's death? Those aren't things you did for me, Father. They're things you did to me." "You watch your mouth, girl," Porter growled. "You're coming home with me if I have to drag you there." "You'll do no such thing," Blake said, his casual posture belying the steel in his voice. "Madeline is my wife now, and she stays with me." "I'll go to the law," Porter threatened. "I'll tell them how you seduced my innocent daughter and forced her to marry you." "You do that," Miller interjected calmly. "And while you're at it, explain those bruises on her face to the judge. I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear how they got there." Porter's gaze flickered to Madeline's face, where the evidence of his last beating was still faintly visible despite beginning to fade. Something ugly passed through his eyes. "She's always been clumsy," he muttered. "Falls down a lot." "That's not what she tells me," Blake said, his voice dropping to a dangerous timbre. "And I believe my wife." The standoff continued for several tense heartbeats, with Porter glaring at Blake and Madeline while the cowboys of Circle M watched silently, many with hands resting near weapons. Finally, Miller spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Mr. Porter, I think you've said your piece. Your daughter is a married woman now, legally beyond your control. The money you claim she took has been repaid. There's nothing more to discuss." "I'm not leaving without her," Porter insisted, though with less conviction than before. "Yes, you are," Miller replied evenly. "My men will escort you and your companions to the edge of our grazing rights. If you return, you'll be treated as trespassers, and we deal harshly with those around here." As if on cue, several of the cowboys moved forward, their hands now openly resting on their weapons. Porter looked around, seeming to realize for the first time how outnumbered he was. "This isn't over," he said, jabbing a finger toward Madeline. "You hear me, girl? This isn't over." Blake stepped forward then, his eyes cold but his voice controlled. "Actually, Porter, it is over. And if you ever come near my wife again, if you ever raise your voice to her or even look at her wrong, I promise you'll regret it in ways you can't imagine." There was something in Blake's tone that sent a chill even through Madeline, a calm certainty that made his words not a threat but a simple statement of fact. Porter must have felt it too, for he took an involuntary step back. "Get off my land," Miller said into the silence that followed. "Now." Surrounded by grim-faced cowboys, Porter had no choice but to comply. He mounted his horse with poor grace, casting one last venomous look at Madeline before turning to ride away, his two companions following closely. Several cowboys accompanied them, ensuring they left Circle M property as Miller had ordered. Only when they were well out of sight did Madeline feel her knees begin to buckle, the stress of the confrontation catching up with her all at once. Blake caught her before she could fall, his strong arm around her waist supporting her. "Easy," he murmured. "It's over. He's gone." "He'll be back," Madeline whispered, her father's last words echoing in her mind. "He doesn't give up." "Maybe," Blake acknowledged, "but neither do I. And you have more than just me watching over you now." Miller approached them, his expression concerned but respectful. "Mrs. Keller, I apologize for the distress this has caused you. Please know that you are welcome here, and that none of my men would ever turn you over to someone who treated you so poorly." Madeline straightened, drawing strength from Blake's support and Miller's unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. I'm sorry to bring my troubles to your doorstep." Miller shook his head. "Family isn't trouble, Mrs. Keller, and as Blake's wife, you're family to the Circle M now." The simple declaration, delivered without fanfare or excessive sentiment, nonetheless brought tears to Madeline's eyes. Family. Something she had not truly had since her mother's death 5 years ago. As the excitement died down and the camp returned to its evening routines, Blake led Madeline away from the others, finding a quiet spot near a stand of aspens where they could speak privately. "Are you all right?" he asked, his eyes searching her face with genuine concern. "I think so," Madeline replied, though her hands still trembled slightly. "I didn't expect him to find us so quickly." "Marshall Davis must have told him about the marriage," Blake reasoned. "It's public record after all. And your father seems like the type to intimidate information out of people." Madeline nodded, knowing all too well how persuasive her father could be when angered. "What happens now? We continue as planned," Blake said. "The drive starts tomorrow and we'll be moving north away from his reach. By the time we reach Butte City, he'll have lost our trail entirely." "And after Butte City?" Madeline asked hesitantly. They had not discussed the future beyond the immediate escape, and now that they were legally married, the question loomed larger than before. Blake took her hands in his expression serious but gentle. "That depends on what you want, Madeline. The marriage is real, legal, and binding, but I won't hold you to it if it's not what you truly desire. In Butte City, you could make a fresh start with or without me." The offer stunned her. After everything he had done, After putting himself between her and her father and risking his reputation by marrying a woman he barely knew, he was still giving her the freedom to choose her own path. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "After going to such lengths to help me." Blake's smile was tinged with sadness. "Because freedom isn't just about escaping someone who hurts you. It's about having the right to decide your own future." He paused, then added more softly, "I meant what I said in my vows, Madeline. I'll protect you and provide for you for as long as you'll have me. But I won't be another man who tries to control you." In that moment, looking into his earnest blue eyes, Madeline felt something shift inside her, a recognition that what had begun as a desperate arrangement might grow into something far more meaningful. This man, this near stranger who was now her husband, saw her not as property or a burden but as a person deserving of choice and dignity. "I don't know what the future holds," she admitted, "but I'd like to face it with you if you're willing." The smile that broke across Blake's face was like sunshine after rain. "I'd like that very much, Madeline Keller." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he kissed her, a real kiss this time, gentle but firm, filled with promise rather than possession. Madeline's heart fluttered in her chest, and for the first time in years, the flutter was born of joy rather than fear. When they returned to the main camp, Pete had supper ready, and the cowboys greeted them with a respectful normalcy that suggested Miller had spoken to them in the interim. No one mentioned the confrontation with her father, though Madeline noticed several of the men positioning themselves around the perimeter of the camp as darkness fell, keeping watch. After supper, Blake set up their tent slightly apart from the others, as Pete had predicted. It was a simple canvas affair, but he had made it as comfortable as possible with bedrolls and blankets arranged neatly inside. "I'll sleep outside if you prefer," he offered as they stood awkwardly before the entrance. "Give you privacy." Madeline considered this. They were married, legally and in the eyes of everyone around them, but the marriage had not yet been consummated, and the thought of that intimacy with a man she was only beginning to know was both frightening and strangely compelling. "No," she decided finally, "it's your tent too. And it will look strange to the others if my husband sleeps outside on our first night." Blake nodded, though she could see the question in his eyes. "I won't touch you without your permission, Madeline, marriage certificate or no." His assurance warmed her, reinforcing her growing trust in him. "Thank you, but I'm not afraid of you, Blake. This is all very new." "For me as well," he admitted with a small smile. "I wasn't exactly planning to acquire a wife when I rode into Silver Creek yesterday." The absurdity of their situation suddenly struck Madeline, and she found herself laughing, a genuine, unburdened laugh that felt foreign after so many years of careful silence in her father's house. Blake joined her, his deep chuckle blending with her lighter tones in a harmony that seemed to promise better days ahead. That night, they slept side by side in the small tent, not touching but close enough to feel each other's warmth. Madeline lay awake for a long time, listening to Blake's steady breathing and the night sounds of the camp around them. For the first time in memory, she fell asleep without fear shadowing her dreams. The cattle drive began at dawn the next day, with the herd strung out across the valley like a living river flowing north. Madeline quickly settled into the rhythm of life on the trail, rising before the sun to help Pete prepare breakfast for the cowboys, then packing up the chuck wagon and traveling ahead of the herd to set up for the midday meal. The work was hard but satisfying, and Pete proved to be a patient teacher despite his gruff exterior. By the third day, Madeline could build a cooking fire in almost any conditions, make biscuits that didn't resemble horseshoes, and identify every herb and spice in Pete's carefully guarded collection. "You're a natural, Mrs. Keller, Pete declared as they worked side by side preparing a stew for the evening meal. Knew it the moment I laid eyes on you. Madeline smiled, pleased by the praise. I had a good teacher. And please call me Madeline. Mrs. Keller still sounds strange to my ears. Pete nodded, understanding in his weathered face. Takes time to settle into a new name. Took my Emma nearly a year before she stopped writing her maiden name on letters after we wed. It was the first time Pete had mentioned a wife, and Madeline looked at him with interest. You're married. Was, Pete corrected, his eyes growing distant. 43 years, till the consumption took her 5 winters ago. Best years of my life. I'm sorry, Madeline said softly. She must have been a special woman. That she was, Pete agreed. Stubborn as a mule and twice as loyal. Followed me from Ohio to California and back east to Montana, never complaining even when times were lean. He eyed Madeline speculatively. You remind me of her a bit. Got the same spark in your eye. Madeline wasn't sure how to respond to the unexpected comparison, but before she could formulate a reply, Blake rode up to the chuck wagon, dismounting in one fluid motion. Smells good, he commented, nodding to Pete before turning to Madeline with a smile that seemed reserved just for her. How are you holding up? Well enough, she replied, returning his smile. Pete's been showing me all his secrets. Not all of them, the old cook grumbled good-naturedly. Got to keep some mystery, or you young folks will think you don't need me anymore. Blake laughed, the sound warming Madeline's heart. In the days since they'd left Silver Creek, she'd seen him gradually relax around her, his natural humor emerging more frequently as they grew more comfortable with each other. No chance of that, Pete. You're the backbone of this outfit, and everyone knows it. Blake turned back to Madeline. I rode ahead to let you know we'll be making an early camp today. There's a storm brewing to the west, and Miller wants the herd settled before it hits. As if on cue, Madeline glanced toward the horizon and saw dark clouds gathering in the distance, the first hint of autumn's changeable weather. Will it be bad? Hard to say, Blake admitted. But best to be prepared. We'll set up the wagon near that stand of cottonwoods by the creek. More shelter there. The storm hit just after sundown, bringing driving rain and wind that bent the cottonwoods nearly double. The cattle grew restless, requiring extra riders to keep them from stampeding, while those not on duty huddled in tents or under the limited shelter of the wagons. Madeline and Pete worked frantically to secure the chuck wagon, tying down everything that might blow away and covering their precious supplies with tarpaulins. By the time they finished, both were soaked to the skin and chilled by the rapidly dropping temperature. Get to your tent, Pete shouted over the howling wind. I'll finish here. You're just as wet as I am, Madeline protested, and your joints must be aching in this cold. The old cook waved her off. Been through worse. Your husband will be worried sick if you don't get yourself somewhere dry. Reluctantly, Madeline made her way to the tent she shared with Blake, fighting against the wind with every step. The tent was shuddering under the onslaught but holding firm thanks to Blake's careful setup. She ducked inside, relieved to find it relatively dry despite the storm raging outside. Blake wasn't there yet, likely still helping with the cattle. Madeline quickly changed into dry clothes, hanging her wet ones on a line Blake had strung across one corner of the tent. The temperature continued to drop as night deepened, and she found herself shivering despite the relative shelter of the tent. It was nearly midnight when Blake finally returned, ducking into the tent with rain streaming from his hat and coat. He looked exhausted, his face drawn with the strain of hours fighting both weather and frightened cattle. You're frozen, Madeline said, immediately moving to help him remove his sodden coat. Here, let me. Blake allowed her to assist him, too tired to protest. The herd settled now, he reported, his voice hoarse from shouting over the storm. "Lost a few head that panicked and ran, but most stayed put once we got them into the trees." "You need dry clothes and rest," Madeline insisted, handing him his spare shirt and jeans from his saddlebag. "Change before you catch your death." With an exhausted nod, Blake turned his back to change, a gesture of modesty that touched Madeline despite the circumstances. When he had donned dry clothes and wrapped himself in a blanket, she insisted he take the bedroll closest to the center of the tent, where it was driest. "You're shivering too," he observed, noticing her trembling despite her attempts to hide it. "Come here." He held open his blanket, offering to share its warmth. Madeline hesitated only briefly before moving beside him. The night was growing colder, and practical concerns outweighed any lingering shyness. Blake wrapped the blanket around them both, his arm coming tentatively around her shoulders. "All right?" he asked softly. Madeline nodded, relaxing gradually against him as his body heat began to warm her. "Yes, thank you." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside while finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence. Madeline found herself studying Blake's profile in the dim light filtering through the canvas, the strong line of his jaw, the slight crook in his nose that suggested it had been broken at least once, the way his hair curled damply against his neck. "You're staring again, Mrs. Keller," Blake murmured, echoing his words from their first morning together, though this time his tone held a hint of teasing. Madeline felt her cheeks warm. "I was just thinking." "About what?" "How strange life is," she admitted. "A week ago, I was trapped in my father's house, believing I would never escape. Now I'm here, in a tent in the middle of nowhere during a storm, married to a man I barely know but somehow trust more than anyone I've ever met." Blake's arm tightened slightly around her shoulders, a gentle pressure that felt like reassurance. "Life has a way of surprising us, not always pleasantly, but sometimes. Sometimes the surprises are worth it." The way he looked at her as he said this made Madeline's heart skip a beat. There was warmth in his gaze and something more, a growing affection that mirrored what she was beginning to feel for him. "Blake," she said softly, "may I ask you something? Anything. When you told my father he would regret hurting me, what did you mean?" Blake was quiet for a long moment, his expression turning serious. "I meant that no man should be allowed to hurt someone weaker than himself without consequences. Your father has spent years thinking his cruelty would go unpunished because you had no one to stand up for you. And now I have you," Madeline said, the realization both comforting and slightly frightening in its implications. "You have me," Blake agreed. "But more importantly, you have yourself, Madeline. I've watched you these past days, how quickly you learn, how hard you work, how kind you are even to strangers. Your father tried to break you, but he failed. That's a strength most people never find." His words touched something deep within her. A part of herself she had almost forgotten existed, the part that had once dreamed of a life beyond fear and pain, the part that had believed in her own worth, despite her father's constant degradation. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for seeing that in me." Blake's hand found hers beneath the blanket, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both protective and equalizing. "I see you, Madeline Keller. And I'm honored to be your husband, however unexpected our marriage might have been." The honesty in his voice drew Madeline closer to him, her head coming to rest naturally against his shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, the storm gradually subsiding outside while something new and fragile bloomed between them, not quite love, perhaps, but its hopeful beginning. As the days turned into weeks, the cattle drive continued northward, crossing rolling hills and winding rivers, the landscape growing more rugged as they approached the winter pastures. Madeline settled fully into her role, becoming not just Pete's assistant, but an essential part of the camp's daily routine. The Cowboys, initially awkward around her, soon treated her with a respectful camaraderie, appreciating her cooking and her quiet competence. Her relationship with Blake evolved as well, growing deeper with each passing day. They spent their evenings talking by the fire, sharing stories of their childhoods. Blake's filled with the rowdy adventures of a large family on a small ranch. Madeline's with bittersweet memories of her mother and the brief happiness they had known before her illness. They learned each other's habits and preferences, how Blake liked his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, how Madeline hummed softly to herself when concentrating on a task, how they both preferred dawn to dusk and silence to idle chatter. Small discoveries that slowly transformed them from strangers bound by circumstance into partners building a life together. Physical intimacy developed gradually between them. What had begun with the practical sharing of warmth during the storm evolved into comfortable closeness, casual touches, and eventually tentative kisses that grew more confident as Madeline's trust in Blake deepened. He never pushed, always letting her set the pace, his patience a constant reminder that this marriage, however hastily entered, was built on respect. It was Madeline who finally bridged the final gap between them, on a clear night when the stars seemed close enough to touch, and the northern pastures were just a day's ride away. "Blake," she whispered as they lay side by side in their tent, her hand finding his in the darkness. "I'm ready." He turned toward her, his eyes questioning in the dim light. "Are you sure? There's no rush, Madeline, we have time." "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter of nervous anticipation in her stomach. "I want to be your wife in every way." Blake's kiss was gentle at first, then deeper as Madeline responded with growing confidence. His hands moved reverently over her, as if she were something precious and fragile, yet his touch ignited a warmth within her that she had never experienced before. "Tell me if I do anything you don't like," he murmured against her skin. "Promise me." "I promise," she whispered back, touched by his concern even in this most intimate moment. Their first time together was slow and tender, Blake's experience guiding Madeline through the initial discomfort to a pleasure she hadn't known existed. Afterward, she lay in his arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart and marveling at how completely her life had changed in the span of a few short weeks. "All right?" Blake asked softly, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her bare shoulder. Madeline smiled against his chest. "More than all right. Happy." The simple words seemed inadequate to describe the fullness in her heart, but Blake seemed to understand. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his arms tightening around her in a protective embrace that promised not possession but partnership. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Madeline Keller," he admitted quietly, the words hanging in the darkness between them like a gift offered without expectation. Madeline raised herself up on one elbow to look at him, her heart swelling at the vulnerable honesty in his eyes. "I think I'm already there," she confessed. "I love you, Blake." His smile in that moment was worth every hardship she had endured to find herself here, in his arms, free and cherished in a way she had never thought possible. The cattle drive reached the northern pastures the next day, the herd settling easily into the lush valley that would shelter them through the coming winter. A small contingent of cowboys would remain to watch over them, but most, including Blake, would return south after a brief rest. "But city next," Blake told Madeline as they packed up the chuck wagon for the final leg of their journey. "We should reach it in about 4 days if the weather holds." Madeline nodded, her mind already turning to the future that awaited them. Though they had spoken of love, They had not yet discussed what would happen once they reached Butt City. Would Blake return to the Circle M? Would she go with him? Or would they make a new start together somewhere else? She was about to voice these questions when a rider approached from the south, his horse lathered from hard riding. It was one of the cowboys who had stayed behind in Silver Creek to finalize arrangements for the winter supplies. "Blake," the man called, dismounting hastily. "Got news you need to hear." Blake straightened, his expression turning serious as he greeted the rider. "What is it, Jim?" Jim glanced at Madeline, then back to Blake, his discomfort obvious. "It's about Elias Porter. He's been causing trouble, asking about you and Mrs. Keller in every town between here and Whispering Pines." Madeline felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the autumn sun. "My father, he's still looking for us." "Yes, madam," Jim confirmed, his expression grim. "And he's not alone. Got a couple of rough characters with him now, offering money for information on your whereabouts." Blake's jaw tightened, his hand instinctively moving to rest on Madeline's shoulder. "What kind of rough characters?" "The hired gun sort," Jim replied bluntly. "One of them's Jed Morgan. You know his reputation." Blake nodded, his expression darkening at the name. Madeline looked between them, fear rising within her. "Who's Jed Morgan?" she asked. "A killer," Blake answered honestly. "He works for whoever pays him, and he's not particular about the job." The implications were clear. Her father had moved beyond legal means to find her. He had hired men who wouldn't hesitate to use violence to accomplish their task. "What do we do?" Madeline asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Blake was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing their options. Then he turned to Jim. "How far behind you are they?" 2 days, maybe 3, Jim estimated. "They were in Silver Creek when I left, but they know you're heading for Butt City. Won't take them long to figure the route." Blake nodded, his decision made. "We change plans. Butt City's too obvious." He turned to Madeline, his expression resolute. "How do you feel about Canada?" "Canada," she repeated, startled. "We're less than 60 miles from the border here," Blake explained. "If we leave now, travel light and fast, we can cross over before Porter and his men catch up. They'd have no jurisdiction there." The suggestion was so unexpected that Madeline needed a moment to process it. Leave Montana entirely, start over in a foreign country. Yet the more she considered it, the more sense it made. Her father's reach was long in Montana, where he had business connections and apparently the means to hire men like Jed Morgan. But in Canada, he would be just another American with no special influence. "What about your job?" she asked Blake. "The Circle M." "Miller will understand," Blake said confidently. "He's a family man. Besides, there's always work for a good cattleman on either side of the border." Madeline looked into his eyes, seeing the determination there and something more. Not just the protective instinct that had first led him to help her, but a deeper commitment born of the love that had grown between them. "All right," she agreed. "Canada it is." The decision made, they moved with purposeful efficiency. Blake spoke briefly with Miller, who not only approved their plan but insisted on providing them with supplies, fresh horses, and a letter of introduction to a rancher he knew near Calgary. "The Circle M takes care of its own," Miller told them as they prepared to leave. "And you're both family now. Come spring, if things have settled down, there'll be a place for you here if you want it." The gratitude Madeline felt for this man and the community he had built brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Miller, for everything." Miller's weather-beaten face softened. "You've brought something good to Blake, Mrs. Keller. That's thanks enough for me." They left at dawn the following day, traveling light and fast with only what they could carry on horseback. Pete hugged Madeline fiercely before they departed, pressing a small leather-bound book into her hands. "My Emma's recipes," he explained gruffly. "Figured you might need them more than me now." It was the most precious gift the old cook could have given her, and Madeline tucked it carefully into her saddlebag, promising to treasure it always. The journey north was challenging but exhilarating. They traveled cross-country rather than following established trails. Blake's knowledge of the territory guiding them through forests and across streams, always moving steadily toward the Canadian border. At night, they made small, smokeless fires and slept close together for warmth, their bodies now familiar and comfortable with each other in ways that still amazed Madeline. On their third day of travel, as they crested a ridge overlooking a vast, rolling plain, Blake pulled his horse to a stop and pointed north. "There it is," he said softly. "Canada. We'll cross over by nightfall if we keep this pace." Madeline gazed at the landscape stretching before them. Indistinguishable from the Montana territory they were leaving behind, yet representing something profound, true freedom from her past. "Blake," she said, turning to him with sudden urgency, "before we cross, there's something I need to say." He looked at her questioningly, concern flickering across his face. "What is it?" "Thank you," Madeline said simply, "for saving me that night by the creek, for standing between me and my father, for marrying me when you barely knew me, for loving me when I was still learning how to love myself." She took a deep breath, then added, "I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I'm grateful every day that you found me." Blake's expression softened, his eyes warming with an emotion that made Madeline's heart swell. "You deserve everything good in this world, Madeline. I'm just honored to be the man who gets to share it with you." He leaned across the space between their horses to kiss her, a gesture that had become familiar yet never lost its power to move her. When they parted, Madeline saw a new resolve in his eyes. "I promise you this," Blake said, his voice low and intense. "In our new life together, you'll never know fear again. Not from your father, not from anyone, and certainly never from me." It was a promise she believed with her whole heart. Not because Blake was physically strong enough to protect her, though he was, but because he had shown her time and again that his greatest strength lay in his unwavering respect for her dignity and freedom. They crossed into Canada as the sun was setting, the border marked only by a small cairn of stones, and the knowledge that they had left Elias Porter's reach behind them. That night, they celebrated their new beginning with the simple joy of being together, making love beneath a canopy of stars that seemed to bless their union with their ancient, unchanging light. The town of Windfall Creek, just north of the border, welcomed them with little curiosity about their sudden arrival. To the hard-working settlers and ranchers of the Canadian frontier, a young couple seeking a fresh start was hardly unusual. With Miller's letter of introduction, Blake quickly secured work with the Bar X Ranch, whose owner was expanding his operation and needed experienced hands. They rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, a modest place with 2 rooms and a stone fireplace that Madeline soon transformed into a home. With Blake's steady income and Madeline's careful management, they slowly accumulated the necessities of a comfortable life: proper furniture to replace their makeshift arrangements, curtains for the windows, a kitchen garden that provided fresh vegetables during the short growing season. Word of Madeline's cooking skills, honed during the cattle drive and expanded through Pete's cherished recipe book, spread quickly through the small community. Soon, she was supplying bread and pies to the general store and occasionally cooking for special events in town, bringing an additional income that they saved carefully for the future. That future took on new meaning when, 6 months after their arrival in Windfall Creek, Madeline discovered she was expecting their first child. The news brought Blake to his knees beside her, his hands gentle on her still flat stomach and tears in his eyes as he promised their unborn child a life filled with love and security. He or she will never know what it's like to be afraid of a parent's hand, Blake vowed. Our child will grow up knowing only kindness and respect. Our children, Madeline corrected softly, placing her hand over his. I want a house full of them, Blake. A real family. The joy in his eyes at her words was answer enough. Their son, James Peter Keller, was born on a snowy December night with the help of the town's midwife. He had Blake's blue eyes and Madeline's auburn hair, and from his first breath, he was the center of their world. Blake proved to be a natural father, as tender with his son as he was with Madeline, never too tired after a long day's work to rock the baby to sleep or change a diaper so Madeline could rest. As James grew from infant to toddler, Madeline found herself reflecting often on the strange, winding path that had led her to this life. The night she had fled her father's house in terror seemed to belong to another lifetime, a dark chapter that had unexpectedly led to the greatest happiness she had ever known. There were still moments when the shadows of her past crept in nightmares that left her gasping for breath, sudden sounds that made her flinch, irrational fears that Blake would somehow transform into the monster her father had been. But each time, Blake's steady presence and unwavering love helped banish those shadows, replacing them with the warmth of their shared present. News from Montana reached them occasionally through traders and travelers. They learned that Elias Porter had indeed tracked them as far as the border before being forced to turn back. Later came word that he had fallen ill, his health deteriorating rapidly in the year following Madeline's escape. The news stirred complex emotions in Madeline, not triumph or satisfaction, but a quiet acceptance that the man who had caused her so much pain was no longer a threat to her or her family. "You want to go back?" Blake asked, when they received word of her father's passing. To settle his affairs or visit his grave? Madeline considered the question carefully before shaking her head. "No, that part of my life is closed now. My home, my family, everything I love is here." Blake nodded, understanding as always. "Then here we stay." And stay they did, putting down roots that grew deeper with each passing year. James was joined by a sister, Emma Sullivan Keller, named for Pete's wife and the woman who had given Madeline shelter when she needed it most. Later came another son, Marcus, whose name honored the ranch owner who had stood beside them against her father. Blake's skills and reliability eventually earned him a partnership in the Bar X, giving them a stake in the land they had come to love. The small cabin was replaced by a proper ranch house, built room by room as their family and fortunes grew. It was a good house, filled with laughter and warmth, and the controlled chaos of a growing family. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, with their children finally asleep after a day of celebration, Blake and Madeline sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the rolling hills that had become as familiar to them as the contours of each other's faces. "Happy?" Blake asked, his hand finding hers as it had countless times over the years. Madeline smiled, the expression coming easily now after so many years of safety and love. "Completely," she assured him. "You, more than I ever thought possible," Blake admitted, bringing her hand to his lips. "Sometimes I still can't believe how lucky I am that I decided to ride along that creek that night." "It wasn't luck," Madeline said softly. "It was providence." Blake smiled at that, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she had come to love. At 35, he was still as handsome as the day they met, though his face now bore the marks of a decade spent working outdoors and laughing with his children. There was silver threading his brown hair at the temples, matching the strands that had appeared in Madeline's auburn locks after Emma's difficult birth. "You ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't met that night?" he asked. Madeline considered the question. "Sometimes." But not for long. The past doesn't hold much interest for me anymore, not when the present is so good and the future so promising. Blake nodded, understanding as always the unspoken parts of her thoughts. You know, when I told your father he'd regret hurting you, I meant it as a threat. I was so angry seeing what he'd done to you that I wanted to make him pay. I remember, Madeline said, recalling the dangerous edge to Blake's voice that day in the cattle camp. But now, Blake continued, I think the truest revenge is simply this: that you're happy, that you're loved, that you've built a beautiful life he can never touch. He lost something precious when he drove you away, something he can never get back. Madeline leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the solid strength that had been her anchor through the ups and downs of the past decade. I never thought of it that way, but you're right. This life, our life, is the best answer to everything he did. As darkness settled around them, and the first stars appeared in the vast Canadian sky, Blake drew Madeline to her feet and into his arms. The kiss they shared was both familiar and new, filled with the depth of feeling that had grown between them over years of partnership, parenthood, and unwavering commitment to each other. I love you, Madeline Keller, Blake whispered against her lips. Today, tomorrow, and for all the days to come. And I love you, Madeline replied, her heart full to overflowing with gratitude for this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. Forever and always. They stood there in the gathering darkness, wrapped in each other's arms, their home glowing with lamplight behind them and their children sleeping peacefully within. From the desperate flight of a battered young woman to this moment of profound contentment, their journey had been unexpected, challenging, and ultimately beautiful beyond anything Madeline could have imagined on that moonlit night when a cowboy found her by a creek and promised that her father would regret his cruelty. And as Blake had promised, so it had come to pass, not through violence or vengeance, but through the quiet triumph of love over fear, of kindness over cruelty, of a future built on respect rather than control. For in creating this life together, they had proven that even the deepest wounds could heal, and that sometimes the darkest beginnings led to the brightest destinations.